Everything good, Scott? Good. All right. Well, good evening, everyone. How's everybody doing? Good. So, anybody recall what we talked about last week? Motifs, that's right. So we're going to do it a second time. It's not going to be a repeat of the exact lesson, but hopefully it will be another motif that can help solidify what it is that we talked about last week so that we can all kind of come together on this. Is there any reason why it's not popping up there, Scott? Is this something I'm doing? Spacebar? Okay. All right. You got it, Kerry? There is one. There is one. There it is. Cool. Yeah. There it is. It's working. Cool. All right. So, lost my train of thought. Talking about motifs, we're going to go over another one now to help solidify this idea. What we discussed last time was how a motif can be something that is either an abstract concept or it can also be a concrete object or a tangible object. And the important part of it is it has to recur multiple times within a writing. And here's the kind of the big important part of that. It recurs, but what is its purpose for recurring? The purpose of its recurrence is to point you to this big idea, to this theme within that particular passage. Everybody go ahead and turn to Mark chapter 5. That's going to be the primary text where we're going to be looking at tonight. It'll be 1 through, I think it's 46. 43, I apologize. But I'm going to read through all of that when time comes. And I know just from personal experience that I hate hearing my own voice, so I'm sure you guys would hate it too. So hopefully if you read it, then it won't be just my voice. And you'll all understand where I'm coming from. So yeah, this is the whole point of a motif. It recurs multiple times within a particular passage, and it points you towards a theme. Okay? Last week we talked about a shepherd as a motif. How far did that span within the Bible? Was it beginning to end, beginning to middle, a third, a quarter? How far did we talk about? Yeah, it pointed you towards a general theme that spanned the entire Bible, and even that shepherd motif showed up throughout the Bible. My point this time is I would like to talk about a motif that occurs within a much smaller section of Scripture, specifically this Mark section. Okay. One thing I forgot to mention last week, we were brainstorming about a bunch of different ideas about what these things might mean, what this motif could be, all these type of things. We might encounter that tonight as well. Here's the important part. All of those things that we were talking about, they might have been true, but they may not have been a motif, if you get what I'm saying. So when we're throwing out all these different ideas, it's important to realize, again, they might be true, but they could be different from what it is that the motif is trying to explain to us. Okay? So, like I'm saying, that's not to discourage you from commenting because we're trying to discover this together. I firmly believe there's going to be a lot of different things that we're going to find in this passage that are going to be helpful, and maybe some of them are going to be true, but they're not going to be helpful for this particular lesson. But that's what we're trying to find out. We're trying to examine this. So, excuse me. As a final reminder, these are our 3 questions that we want to use, or they can be used to help us guide our examination of these motifs. We're going to start with, are there any patterns that repeat within this passage, whether they're ideas, symbols, or plot structures? Then we have to ask, do these patterns have anything to do with this central theme or the message of the book? Sometimes I call it the big idea. And if they do, how do they illuminate and relate to the theme? So, without further ado, we're going to read Mark. beginning in chapter 5, verse 1. So they came to the other side, that is Jesus and his disciples, to the other side of the lake, to the region of the Gerasenes. Just as Jesus was getting out of the boat, a man with an unclean spirit came from the tombs and met him. He lived among the tombs, and no one could bind him anymore, not even with a chain, for his hands and feet had often been bound with chains and shackles. But he had torn the chains apart and broken the shackles in pieces. No one was strong enough to subdue him. Each night and every day among the tombs and in the mountains, he would cry out and cut himself with stones. When he saw Jesus from a distance, he ran and bowed down before him. Then he cried out with a loud voice, "Leave me alone, Jesus, Son of the Most High God. I implore you, by God, do not torment me." For Jesus had said to him, "Come out of that man, you unclean spirit." Jesus asked him, "What is your name?" And he said, "My name is Legion, for we are many." He begged Jesus repeatedly not to send them out of the region. There on the hillside a great herd of pigs was feeding. And the demonic spirits begged him, "Send us into the pigs, let us enter them." Jesus gave them permission. So the unclean spirits came out and went into the pigs. Then the herd rushed down the steep slope into the lake, and about 2,000 were drowned in the lake. Now the herdsmen ran off and spread the news in the town and countryside, and the people went out to see what had happened. They came to Jesus and saw the demon-possessed man sitting there, clothed and in his right mind, the one who had the legion, and they were afraid. Those who had seen what had happened to the demon-possessed man reported it, and they also told about the pigs. Then they asked Jesus to leave the region, and as he was getting into the boat, the man who had been demon-possessed asked if he could go with him. But Jesus did not permit him to do so. Instead, he said to him, "Go to your home and to your people, and tell them what the Lord has done for you, that he had mercy on you." So he went away and began to proclaim in the Decapolis what Jesus had done for him, and all were amazed. When Jesus had crossed again in a boat to the other side, a large crowd gathered around him, and he was by the sea. Then one of the synagogue rulers named Jairus came up, and when he saw Jesus, he fell at his feet. He asked him urgently, "My little daughter is near death. Come and lay your hands on her, so that she may be healed and live." Jesus went with him, and a large crowd followed and pressed around him. Now a woman was there who had been suffering from a hemorrhage for 12 years. She had endured a great deal under the care of many doctors and had spent all she had. Yet instead of getting better, she grew worse. When she heard about Jesus, she came up behind him in the crowd and touched his cloak, for she kept saying, "If only I touch his clothes, I will be healed." At once the bleeding stopped, and she felt in her body that she was healed of her disease. Jesus knew at once that power had gone out from him. He turned around in the crowd and said, "Who touched my clothes?" His disciples said to him, "You see the crowd pressing against you, and you say, 'Who touched me?'" But he looked around to see who had done it. Then the woman, with fear and trembling, knowing what had happened to her, came and fell down before him and told him the whole truth. He said to her, "Daughter, your faith has made you well. Go in peace and be healed of your disease." While he was still speaking, people came from the synagogue ruler's house, saying, "Your daughter has died. Why trouble the teacher any longer?" But Jesus, paying no attention to what was said, told the synagogue ruler, "Do not be afraid, just believe." He did not let anyone follow him except Peter, James, and John, the brother of James. They came to the house of the synagogue ruler, where he saw a noisy confusion and people weeping and wailing loudly. When he entered, he said to them, "Why are you distressed and weeping? The child is not dead, but asleep." And they began making fun of him. But he put them all outside, and he took the child's father and mother and his own companions and went into the room where the child was. Then gently taking the child by the hand, he said to her, "Talitha koum," which means, "Little girl, I say to you, get up." The girl got up at once and began to walk around. She was 12 years old. They were completely astonished at this. He strictly ordered that no one should know about this and told them to give her something to eat. So, right away, we're asking ourselves, are there any patterns that repeat in this book? Ideas, symbols, plot structures, anything. Is there some sort of pattern that occurs with our first person here? He's typically known as the demoniac. You can call him person possessed by demons, unclean spirits, whatever. Is there some pattern that we see with this person as it relates to these other two? Okay, healing is one. What else do we see? You got to speak up. I apologize. Crowds of people. Okay. Power of Christ. Roger. Incurable diseases. They believed in him. Yeah. What else? I apologize. Jesus healed all of them, so he was the instrument of that healing. Redemption. So they all got some sort of redemption. Okay.
Well, Jesus is establishing who he is, that he is God. And
Okay.
he has power over diseases and power over Satan.
Okay, so Jesus is showing some sort of power over disease and Satan himself. Okay. Any others? I apologize. I thought I heard something, but I'm not sure. Love. Okay, so Jesus displaying his love for these people. Anything else?
It was all something that could not be done by man.
So something that, what was the something that couldn't be done by man?
The doctors couldn't heal the woman, man couldn't expound and find the demonic, and nobody could heal death.
Okay, so kind of what was said before about incurable. And here Jesus shows his power again, right? Autumn? Fear of what? Fear of Jesus' power, you said? Okay. Fear. Fear of his power. It's an interesting one. Cindy and then Janine.
Sometimes Jesus talks a lot, but in this story, at least what's recorded, is he's kind of quiet, and he just doesn't.
I noticed that too. Yeah, Jesus obviously has many things to say, and in these passages he has very little to say, it seems like. Yet there's still a lot of power behind that, Janine.
In this situation, he didn't take his time, but he knew what he was going to do, and he was on the way to heal the daughter when this other woman came, and he stopped and talked to her and took care of her. Then the daughter had died there by the time he got there.
Yeah, that's kind of odd, isn't it? It's kind of odd, and it's almost like there's a reason, as I think you're alluding to, why those two stories are connected. I used to kind of view them as separate. Like, well, yeah, he healed a woman who was hemorrhaging, and then he also raised Jairus' daughter. But I think there's a very strong connection, and that's what we're kind of looking for here. Anything else that jumps out at anybody? Let's think Old Testament. Is there anything that was important in the Old Testament that kind of links these individuals or these three events? Unclean. How so? Yeah? That's a good trick. Okay. Okay. We notice anything else? Uncleanness, unclean. They're all great ideas. You have me thinking about a lot of different things. I was kind of focused on one, but that's why I wanted to hear from everyone else.
They not only know who he is, but they have this incredible faith. Even the demonic guy, he knows who he is, and he says, "Don't." Does he say, "Send us out" or something?
Mm-hmm.
Don't send us out.
Right.
So they know that he has this power. The woman who touched him said, "If I just touch his cloak, that's all I need to do."
So that's feeding on what? I feel like you know what you're saying and I'm not, so I'm trying to figure it out.
Just they have so much faith
Okay.
that they don't even, they just, the incredible amounts of faith.
Okay.
He can do it.
Yeah, I agree. I see that through all of them. Let me start chasing this down a little bit, okay? So with the demoniac, I focused on the uncleanness as a motif, right? It's not a concrete, it's not a tangible object. Obviously, it's an abstract concept, this idea of uncleanness. So when we're dealing with this demon-possessed man, he was possessed by unclean spirits, and I think it's worth noting how many were there. A rough estimate, I guess. It was a legion worth. Christy.
Well, 2,000 pigs went into the sea.
That's kind of my thinking too. I think it's reasonable to estimate about 2,000. Nonetheless, the demon makes it clear that there are many of them inhabiting this person. It wasn't just one, wasn't just two, it was many. Many demons inhabited this man. What else did he do? He wandered around where? In the graveyards. What's significant about that? Okay, so I heard unclean, death. Anything else? Where does it talk about that being a problem? Yeah, you caught it. Yeah, it's right there. Numbers 19:16, if anybody cares to look at it with me. And whoever touches the body of someone killed with a sword in the open fields, or the body of someone who died of natural causes, or a human bone, or a grave, will be unclean 7 days. Okay? What was kind of the penalty for becoming unclean in this way? I know I just alluded to it, but what did that look like? Okay, so you had to be separated from everyone. What was that like? Could you go into the market? Could you go to church services, religious services, whatever you want to call them? Not really. Could you live within the community? In certain circumstances, no, you were not allowed at all. Sometimes you could just stay within your house. But yeah, you were made to be separated. You had to be separated. You were unclean. Okay? That was not terrible, I guess, for 7 days. But think about what this guy was dealing with. It wasn't just 7 days, or so it seemed. Like everybody knew about him. What did they try to do with him? They had tried to help him by shackling him. Like they had to physically restrain him, and he was still breaking free and removing himself from this community. Now, whether it was his fault or not, that's, I guess, up for debate. Nonetheless, he was still unclean, and even by the ritual laws, he was going to have to remain outside of the community. Okay? He was possessed by demons, had to live outside of this community, right? I think it's also worth noting as well, I can't recall who said it, but that the unclean spirits were driven into unclean animals, these pigs that ran down the hillside. What do we think about the hemorrhaging woman?
She would have been unclean and living outside of her community for 12 years.
Yeah. Why is that?
Well, in the Old Testament, women had to go to the tent. You went away because apparently men couldn't handle it. I don't know.
Right. I was going to say, I'm going to test you. I wouldn't have known this either if I hadn't looked it up. All those different laws. I know they're in there somewhere, right? So yeah, this particular woman suffered from, it's called, depending on which translation you use, a hemorrhage. I think it's pretty reasonable to conclude that this wasn't simply like a boil that was leaking blood. More than likely it was some sort of vaginal hemorrhage, akin to a menstruation, but it was something that was obviously ongoing for 12 years. 12 years. 12 years. And so in Leviticus 15:25, it says, when a woman's discharge of blood flows many days, not at the time of her menstruation, or if it flows beyond the time of her menstruation, all the days of her discharge of impurity will be like the days of her menstruation. She is unclean. Any bed she lies on, all the days of her discharge will be to her like the bed of her menstruation. Any furniture she sits on will be unclean, like the impurity of her menstruation. And anyone who touches them will be unclean, and he must wash his clothes, bathe in water, and be unclean until evening. What's interesting too is we also see what you guys have kind of already alluded to. There's a faith aspect to it. How does she demonstrate this?
She just tries to touch his clothes, like the on the down low.
Okay, so on the down low meaning secretive.
Yeah.
Okay. How does that demonstrate faith? I thought I heard you say something, Just. No? Okay. How are we showing faith by that, though? Like if I just wanted to touch somebody's clothes secretly, does that demonstrate my faith, or I just want to touch the clothes?
She goes against all the laws. She's in among a crowd. She's not allowed to be there.
Mm.
And it stands to reason that some of the people are gonna know her. She's the lady who never comes around. So I think they know, and I think she pushes up against it and says, well, too bad about that. Gotta touch his clothes.
It's
She defies the laws. I think her faith pushes her to defy the laws.
it's definitely an interesting scenario or conundrum, I guess, and we'll talk about that towards the end here. But we can see that nonetheless she seeks Jesus in faith. If I only touch his clothes. That's how much faith she had. If I only touch his clothes. And then, of course, Jesus healed her. This is similar, of course, to our demoniac here. Let's talk about Jairus' daughter. I wish I had a name for her, but that's all I have is Jairus' daughter. So unfortunately, I have to keep calling her that. What do we notice? And just as a fair warning, there are many more people involved in this than just Jesus and Jairus' daughter, right? So what do we see?
When he came to beg Jesus, she was still alive. And in the meantime, she died when Jesus was on the way.
Okay. How is that fitting with this pattern that we're developing here? Because you're absolutely right, and I think there is something to it, but how do you see that?
He knew where he was going, and he kept to it, and Jairus believed in him.
Okay. So Jairus was showing faith, is that what you're saying? Okay. Yes.
I think too, it's an element of time. Jesus knew of it, but he didn't rush to her home.
Okay.
He took his time.
Okay. So alluding to, if I'm saying this the wrong way, please correct me. There was a time that was being orchestrated?
Well, to the Father, here it was urgent.
Okay.
However, Jesus did not take that as an urgent manner, so his mannerism of delay showed all of those who saw the girl rise that it doesn't matter whether it's life or death to Jesus, he can still heal.
Very interesting. Yeah, thank you. Very interesting. Vance?
There's a pattern of doubt between each of the three cases. I think it's most apparent in the case of Jairus' daughter, because there's actually people laughing at Jesus. He says, no, she's not dead, she's just gone to sleep. Now, I think implicitly there was doubt in the other cases of demonic, people that have tried to bind this person, so they see Jesus interacting, they probably think they'll find the same way. And similarly with the hemorrhaging woman. So there's a pattern of doubt in each, but of course Christ overcomes that with his power.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Just to sum up, there was a thread of doubt that kind of runs between all these different instances with Jesus or interactions with Jesus. Not necessarily from the principal people interacting with Jesus, but perhaps people on the peripheral. Is that correct, Vance? Okay. Anything else that we see with Jairus' daughter?
In each case, something leaves something.
Something leaves something?
In the
Very interesting.
What kind of carried with that routine uncleanness, if she was still alive, she wouldn't be considered unclean. The moment he died, he's not supposed to touch.
Okay, very interesting. Anything else? Janine?
He sent those that scoffed at him out of the room
Mm-hmm.
when he healed her.
Yeah, but how is that significant to you?
Well, I believe that in most of the cases that we read about, he didn't want everybody running out and telling what he had done.
Right.
And so he took Peter, James, and John, I think, with him or something like that, but her parents were there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I thought that was interesting too, and I kind of keyed on that. I don't know that it's going to deal directly with this lesson, but I keyed on that as well, this idea of him removing some of these people from the house. Anything else?
I couldn't hear what Jesse said, but did she say because his daughter was dead now, she's unclean?
Yes, yeah, that is what you said. Yeah, the daughter was dead, and therefore her corpse was unclean.
So she fits in the storyline of all of the human.
Yeah, Cindy?
The unclean didn't make these people, there was nothing wrong with these people. They weren't bad people or anything. It was circumstances
Mm-hmm.
that caused them to be in these situations.
Yeah.
So just in case you were getting the idea that they must have all, I don't know how to say it. It was just a circumstance they found themselves in. And Jesus, it doesn't matter, like somebody said, he's supposed to take you no matter what.
Yeah, and I think that is something that's worth noting. A lot of times whenever we hear the word uncleanness, we equate it with sin. It's not necessarily the case. Obviously, a woman's menstrual cycle, they were considered unclean for that period of time. I don't think anybody could argue that because the woman has sinned that they have a menstrual cycle. That's not going to make sense. But there is a point that's being made by God when he handed these laws down about his holiness, the necessity for being clean before him in a ritual sense. So yes, sin and uncleanness are not the same things. They don't have to cause each other. And I would probably argue with these cases, we have no evidence to suggest that sin was the cause of this uncleanness. Okay, but I think that is something worth noting. Anything else? Okay.
I think all of them demonstrate that none of it would have happened in any of the cases without 100% faith, because the demon knew who he was. The lady that came up to him risked everything by going around people breaking the law, because she believed that was going to heal her. And the last guy left his daughter at the time of his death, and she never would have done
Yeah.
things without believing that that was the only way she was going to get saved.
Yeah, there's definitely a theme or a thread, however you want to say it, of faith, and I appreciate that so much. Sticking with the uncleanness motif here that I'm trying to examine, we see that Jairus sought Jesus in faith. Jairus' daughter then died, and as we talked about before in Numbers 19:14, it says, "This is the law. When a man dies in a tent, anyone who comes into the tent and all who are in the tent will be ceremonially unclean." Did I say that right? Ceremonially unclean 7 days. And then, of course, Jesus heals, if we want to use that word, Jairus' daughter. He raises her from the dead. So now we have to ask ourselves, what's the big idea with these passages? Perhaps there is none. But maybe there is. What kind of ideas, what kind of themes can we derive from this? We've kind of hinted at a few of them. But now it's time to, if we're focusing on a particular motif, what is the theme we're coming up with here? Kate?
I started thinking about how the people who didn't usually have access to Jesus or other people, like if you physically showed they now have access all of a sudden, and that maybe you look into further on in the Bible, which wasn't, and you had the Gentiles who were on the outside, and they were trying to bridge that and show that you do have access.
That's an interesting one. I had not considered that at all, but I can definitely see that. Yeah. Mona?
I think it would show the superiority of Christ in all those instances over the old law. He was tearing down the old law and and showing that, yeah, he's more superior.
Yeah, the superiority of Christ, I can definitely see that. What other ideas, big ideas, do we grab out of their vents?
In each of these cases, Christ was the only person, the only source for this physical salvation. And so for the demonic, for the woman, and for the child, nobody on earth could rescue these three folks but Christ. Similarly, on a spiritual level, that's true for us today. In 1 John 2, that if anyone sins, we have an advocate with the Father, who is Jesus Christ the righteous, and he himself is the propitiation for our sin, not for ours only, but for those of the whole world. So I think it shows the demonstration of that on a smaller but then a much grander scale as well.
Yeah, definitely. How Christ is our only source of salvation in these circumstances. Charlie? So Christ as the source of cleansing? Is that a fair way to sum that up? Okay. Christina?
I see that all three of these people started did it on behalf of his daughter. They all brought Jesus. It wasn't Jesus seeking them. They had to go find him.
That is an interesting point. Yeah, the theme of people in need seeking Jesus as opposed to Jesus physically grabbing hold of them and finding them. Yes?
I think also it's interesting that these are not people who made a mistake and had an issue that Jesus was healing. These were things that were thrust upon them of no control of theirs. And so that's a difference sometimes of when we sin willingly
Mhm.
versus when things are thrust upon us.
How would you sum that up in a theme? Because I have my idea, but I don't want to put my words in your mouth for that.
The theme, if you go out and do something that is going to be harmful to someone else or to yourself,
Mhm.
yes, you can ask for forgiveness, but would Jesus heal us from our own mistakes?
Okay. Very good. Jesus heals us from our mistakes. Yes?
I think it helps the cleanness part, but I don't see where Jesus did the law for being around unclean people.
You don't see where he did what now? I apologize.
Where he followed the law.
Okay. Is that something that you're saying is a theme from this, or are you asking a question from me?
I
Okay. Okay. Uh, maybe, right? And maybe that's not a theme, but perhaps a pattern, if you see what I'm saying. And that's where we're getting technical now with, like, well, where's this going to fit within this motif scheme? But that definitely is a pattern that has emerged through these three different things. The idea of Jesus not, I have to be careful with how I phrase this, by not abiding by the law and a conventional understanding of what that meant. Is that fair to say? Hope I don't get reamed over that later. Ottoman and Tyler.
Brian McCabe and my mom were saying he's showing them that you don't have to be following. Cade's saying he's like the bridge between old law and new law, and he's not following the old law, and he's going to all these three people in the same day, within seemingly the same hours, and he's running around with man unclean, going to next person unclean, and there's no following the Jewish law. There's none of that going on.
Okay. And I guess the way I might, the frame I might understand that through is the idea of, was the Sabbath created for man, or was man created for Sabbath? And that's where he healed this man on the Sabbath, as Randy talked about, and the anger that was shown towards him from that. I think that there is a similar thing going on here that's being shown. Tyler, and then I saw another hand.
Well, by the time he was done, they were no longer unclean, right? They were no longer dead or no longer possessed or no longer have the disease.
Right.
So by that time, he wouldn't be around an unclean person because they were made clean.
So he rectifies that. Fair to say? Paula and then Clay.
But it's not that he disregarded the law most of the time. He followed it
Mhm.
where he could, but he was showing us that there were more important
Yeah.
things than the law that they should be interested in.
Right, and that's why I had to kind of take a step back and say that when he talks about what's Sabbath for the man or man for the Sabbath, there's more important things at stake than simply, not doing work on the Sabbath, and that's where the healing comes in. Clay?
One thing to note, especially with all of the miracles, they were all a physical healing, not a spiritual salvation. None of the miracles that we see created a spiritual salvation. The only one that you can look at, and I don't know that it would even be a miracle, the thief on the cross, that he said because of his faith he was healed from there on that day.
Yeah.
No miracles created any spiritual salvation.
It,
It's a physical healing.
yeah, and it is interesting to note that we don't see necessarily a spiritual salvation that comes directly from that miracle, and that we could go on and on and on about those different scenarios. So yeah, it is interesting to note. What kind of a theme are we picking out from this, though, Cindy?
John 20:30 tells you.
What is it?
Therefore, many other signs Jesus also performed in the presence of the disciples, which are not written in this book, but these have been written, so that you may believe that Jesus is the Christ, the Son of God, and that believing you may have life in his name. I'm sure there's others in there too, but that one's bona fide.
Sure. It's hard to argue against that one, for sure. This is the one that I landed on, and again, y'all have all brought some extremely interesting ideas to me that are definitely going to make me reflect on what we talked about with respect to just these passages. But trying to hone in on this idea of what a motif is, finding this pattern, and then seeing what kind of a theme is illustrated by this. This is the one that I landed on, and it's the idea of Jesus being the ultimate power of restoration. And again, focusing on the idea of uncleanness. There's so many other things that we could probably derive from this, from these passages, but this is the one that I was keying on. With that in mind, how can we see these people demonstrating that? This idea of uncleanness, how is it illustrated? How is it like emphasizing that theme to us with this particular individual? What do we see? We're focusing on the idea of uncleanness, right? This was a man who was inundated with uncleanness, and he was abandoned to it. And he was healed and made clean by Jesus. He was possessed by literally thousands of demons that no one could physically restrain him in order to help him. And he was cut off from his people. The Levitical law, it talks about the penalty being, you are cut off. He shall be cut off from his people while ritually unclean. Jesus arrived and immediately had control over the demons. And he effectively had control over that man too. And Jesus then, with a simple gesture or a word, removed the unclean spirits from the man. He turned what was a possible lifetime of suffering and uncleanness and reversed it in an instant to wholeness and restoration. We see the hemorrhaging woman. She was unclean for 12 years, and she had spent everything she had and seen many doctors. But instead of being healed, she became worse. She experienced daily embarrassment from the bleeding itself, as well as the constant humiliation of being a perpetual outcast, unable to experience many of the social and religious gatherings because she was always unclean. Anyone she touched would be unclean as well. She believed Jesus would heal her, not by having some sort of earth-shattering, face-to-face experience, a long-winded discussion, a debate perhaps, or even some overwhelming miracle in front of everybody, but by merely touching his clothing. And she did so secretly behind him so that he wouldn't see her. When we read the parallel account in Luke, that account mentions that she was touching the edge of Jesus' cloak. And it's interesting because this was also the location where God commanded his people to sew tassels onto the corners of their clothing. And that tassel would have been a sign of Jesus' own ritual purity. Now, can we say for certain that she touched that tassel? I can't say 100%, but I think it is interesting, and there is some evidence to suggest perhaps that was what was going on. And this woman was torn between her desperate need to be cleansed while keeping others from becoming unclean like her. And ultimately, her faith in Jesus won out. And he proved to her and to us that he is the great physician. Not the okay or the good or the sometimes great. The always great physician who can do the impossible. He will heal, he will cleanse, and he will restore, no matter how hopeless the situation seems. And this brings us to Jairus and his daughter. Jairus was desperate to have a healing from Jesus as well. And my view on this particular passage was that Jairus recognized Jesus as having the power to heal the living, but was unsure about Jesus as having the power over death itself. And this is why Jesus told Jairus, after he'd received word his daughter was dead, "Do not be afraid, just believe." Jairus' house had become unclean, and even worse, it was plagued by the untimely death of his 12-year-old daughter. But Jesus paid no mind to those who made fun of him, but instead led his disciples inside and removed the mockers. He then touched the unclean corpse that had become a visual reminder to Jairus of his shattered family. And with only a touch and a term of endearment, the little girl rose by Jesus' power. Jesus had once more cleansed and restored the people, this time from death itself. So that's kind of my 2 cents on this motif on uncleanness and how it goes through these different pericopes, these different passages, and ultimately what that's revealing to us. And this is, again, my opinion, that Jesus is the ultimate power of restoration. No matter how hopeless the situation was for any of these people, he was able to overcome that. And the same obviously can apply to us. No matter what our circumstances in life, we can overcome when we put our faith, which I think is a huge point of these passages too, when we put our faith in him. Any other comments or questions about anything that's going on? Larry?
When I look at the gentleman in Galilee, Cana, and Jesus went, the man came to Jesus and said, "Hey, my son is sick." And what got my attention is Jesus says in verse 48 of chapter 4 of John, it says, "Unless you see signs and wonders, you will not believe." And I think Jesus is beginning his ministry recently. We can look at Hebrews chapter 2, where it talks about signs and wonders, God being a witness through those miraculous works that Jesus did. Wasn't necessarily, we know a physician is not there for the health, but a physician is there for the sick. And we're all sick in that sense of sin. And Jesus had made that statement, I go to the poor and I go to those that are in trouble. So I'm wondering, we know that the woman had faith, and we also know that the gentleman, his daughter, he had faith. The demons had faith as well. So I'm wondering why maybe these miracles were done in simplicity, just to magnify the deity of Christ and simplicity.
I think there's an argument to be made for that. I mean, we can go round and round about it, but that's kind of where I lean. But any other comment, Janine?
These were all rules under the old law.
Mm-hmm.
Almost every one of them.
I missed that last part. I apologize.
Every one of them were rules under the old law.
Right. And I think that is, we could probably spend a whole day talking about that too, but I think that's fascinating how it's this paradoxical relationship. The one who was sent to be the perfect example and uphold the law seemingly broke the law, yet showed us the better way, if that makes sense, to understand the law and to fulfill the law. It's fascinating to me. James?
Interesting. I was thinking that, as I said, in a bunch of these cases, you have to present yourself to the priest who would say you're clean, unclean, so on and so forth.
Mm-hmm.
And Jesus did do that on occasion, was like in men who had leprosy, so you don't present yourself to the priests. But then I was thinking, just thinking just top of my head, I was remembering in Hebrews chapter 4, it says, being that we have a great high priest in Jesus,
Mm-hmm.
I think, well, technically, I was just thinking out loud, maybe he was the great high priest, so he can clean you, or he can heal you, and say, well, you're clean at the same time, so he was fulfilling the law, seeing that he was the high priest.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of interpreting that too. It kind of echoes back to the hemorrhaging woman. Go in peace, your faith has made you well, right? He essentially pronounces her clean. It's interesting. Mitch?
You know, he didn't violate the law, but he showed he had power over it, because what he did was, through his miracles, he made that which was unclean clean. So
Mhm.
his actions, even though he was engaging with unclean people, made him clean.
Exactly.
He showed the difference between I can engage with somebody unclean and make them clean.
Definitely.
Not violate the law, I don't have power over the law.
Definitely. Definitely. It's fascinating to explore all those different facets of his life and his power in that sense. We're a little bit over time, but any other comments or questions about anything? Yeah. If not, Roger.
On the lady, that is bleeding her hand, she was already healed. And but he wanted her to, and he already knew who it was.
Mm-hmm.
This guy who, he asked people, and he wanted to let that lady know too, that she is now no longer, she's no longer unclean. She's healed, and now she can go about her normal life.
Yeah.
The person know it, other than that, he had the power was over them, and that she is now healed and resume normal life.
Right. Not only healing, but providing the assurance that comes with that healing. So I thank you all for your comments, and we are dismissed.